What if the person you trusted most in the world shattered everything you believed in? A husband caught in the lies of his wife's betrayal, two lovers, two secrets, and the truth no one saw coming. Can a marriage survive such a deep wound? Watch as the struggle for trust and redemption unfolds. This is only the beginning. Will they rebuild, or is it already too late? Sarah Monroe stood in front of the large kitchen window, staring out at the quiet streets of La Jolla, California. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the neighborhood, and the familiar stillness of her suburban life filled her with an unsettling sense of emptiness. For most, this was a picture-perfect life. A beautiful home, a loving husband, 2 kids in college, and a thriving career. But Sarah felt none of it. She felt invisible, like a ghost walking through the motions of a life she no longer recognized. The weight of her thoughts pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She wasn't unhappy, at least not in the conventional sense. She had everything anyone could ask for, except for one thing: connection. The bond she once had with Michael, her husband of 20 years, had frayed over time. What was once a spark of passion had dwindled into the cold routine of daily life. Another late night at work, Sarah muttered under her breath, almost too softly to hear. She glanced at the clock on the wall. Michael had yet to come home. He was always busy, always working on the next project, the next big deal. She couldn't remember the last time they had shared a meal together, or even talked beyond the daily pleasantries. It wasn't as if they fought. No, they just drifted. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the countertop. She picked it up, her heart quickening as she saw Alex's name on the screen. A twinge of guilt hit her, but it was quickly followed by an undeniable sense of relief. She had grown so used to the emptiness that when Alex entered her life, it felt like a breath of fresh air. "Hey," she answered, her voice low but steady. "Are you still coming tonight?" Alex's voice was smooth, warm, a stark contrast to the coldness Sarah had been living in. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to tell him that she couldn't, she shouldn't. But another part of her, the part that had been starved for attention and affection, urged her to say yes. It had been weeks since she'd felt alive, weeks since someone had made her feel seen. "I'll be there in an hour," she said before hanging up, the decision feeling both comforting and terrifying. She set the phone down and walked over to the full-length mirror. Her reflection stared back at her, tired eyes, hair pulled into a messy bun, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. She used to be someone who was full of life, full of dreams, but now she was just a shadow of that person. A knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It was too soon for Michael. She moved toward the door, the unease in her stomach growing. She opened it to find Lila, her best friend, standing there with a raised eyebrow. "You're going, aren't you?" Lila asked, her voice laced with both concern and curiosity. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't have an answer for her friend. She wasn't sure why she was doing this, why she was about to meet Alex, someone who was nothing but a distraction from the hollow space that had formed between her and Michael. I think I need this," Sarah finally whispered, her voice barely audible. Lila studied her for a moment before stepping inside. "You know this isn't going to fix anything, right?" "I know," Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "But right now it feels like the only thing that's real." Lila didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at Sarah, her expression soft but filled with concern. She knew her friend was lost in a way that was hard to describe. Lila had been through her own struggles, but this wasn't the Sarah she knew. I don't want you to lose yourself," Lila said gently, reaching out to touch Sarah's arm. "I'm already lost," Sarah muttered, her eyes welling up. She quickly wiped away the tear that had fallen, embarrassed by the raw emotion. Lila didn't push further. She just gave Sarah a brief hug before stepping back, giving her the space she needed. "You've got to do what you think is right, but remember, this is your life. Don't let anyone else write it for you." Sarah nodded silently as her friend left. She stood there for a moment, the quiet of the house surrounding her. The walls felt closer, the air heavier, and for the first time in what seemed like ages, she wasn't sure if she could breathe. Her phone buzzed again. Alex. She had no more time for hesitation. She grabbed her coat and walked toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her choice, her decision, and whether it was right or wrong, she couldn't stop herself from stepping into the unknown. As she stepped out into the night, the cold air bit at her skin. She didn't look back. Sarah sat at the dimly lit table, her fingers tracing the rim of her wineglass. The air between her and Alex was thick with tension, though they hadn't spoken in what felt like an eternity. He was sitting across from her, his gaze never leaving hers, but there was an understanding in the silence. A mutual acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had been growing between them. "I never thought I'd be here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of background chatter in the cafe. "I never thought it would come to this." Alex leaned in slightly, the warm light from the candles flickering in his eyes. "And yet here we are," he said softly. "Sometimes life doesn't go the way we plan, but that doesn't mean it's wrong." Sarah swallowed hard, her emotions bubbling up as she stared at him. She felt both comforted and terrified by the intensity of his gaze. She knew what this was, what this moment meant. The affair had started as a flirtation, a distraction, but now it had become something deeper, something she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. And yet, there she was. "I didn't plan this either," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "But you make me feel seen, Alex. I don't know how to explain it. It's like I'm not invisible when I'm with you." Alex's lips curved into a slight smile, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was one of understanding, of empathy. "You're not invisible, Sarah. You never were. You just forgot how to see yourself." The words hit her harder than she expected. Her chest tightened as she struggled to breathe. The last few months of her marriage felt like a lifetime. Michael had become a stranger to her, emotionally absent, caught up in his own world, leaving her to fade into the background. It wasn't just the physical distance, it was the emotional distance that cut the deepest. Alex reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah didn't pull away. Instead, she let him touch her, let him hold her hand gently in his. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes. "I don't know if I'm making the right choice," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "But I feel alive when I'm with you. I haven't felt alive in so long." Alex squeezed her hand softly, his thumb brushing against her skin in a comforting motion. "Life is complicated, but sometimes we need to live for ourselves first. You deserve to feel alive again, Sarah. You've been living for everyone else for too long." A part of her knew that what Alex was saying was dangerous, that they were treading on unstable ground. But another part of her, the part that had been buried for so long, didn't care. She didn't want to think about the consequences. She didn't want to think about Michael, about their fractured marriage, or about the damage that was already done. She just wanted to feel something, anything, that made her feel whole again. Her gaze flickered to the door and she caught a glimpse of a couple laughing as they walked in, their fingers intertwined. A pang of sadness hit her, sharp and sudden. That used to be her and Michael, or at least that's what she thought it had been. Now their connection felt like a distant memory, a photograph she could no longer reach. Do you think I'm a bad person?" Sarah asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alex's expression softened, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite place. Sympathy? Sadness? Desire? "No, Sarah. You're not a bad person. You're just lost. And sometimes, when you're lost, you need to find something that makes you feel found again." Sarah closed her eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew this wasn't right. She knew she was betraying Michael, betraying the vows they had made to each other. But at that moment, she couldn't bring herself to care. The emptiness inside her had been suffocating, and Alex had filled that void, even if only for a short while. "Maybe I don't know what I'm doing," she murmured, her voice shaking. "But I feel like I'm running out of time to figure it out." Alex's thumb brushed across her knuckles once more. Time doesn't run out unless you let it. You still have time, Sarah. You just have to choose what you want. But as Sarah looked into his eyes, she realized that she wasn't just choosing between him and Michael. She was choosing between a life of safety and routine, or one filled with uncertainty and risk. A life where she could finally feel something, even if it was wrong. Her heart raced, torn between the man who had been her partner for years and the man who had awakened something inside her. It was a choice that she wasn't sure she was ready to make, but she knew it was one she would have to face sooner or later. Before she could respond, Alex's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the fragile tension. He glanced at the screen, then back at her. "I should go," he said softly, his voice laced with something that almost sounded like regret. "But I'll be here when you're ready." Sarah didn't say anything as he stood up and left. She was left alone sitting at the table, her fingers still tingling from his touch. The weight of what she was doing crashed down on her, but in that moment she didn't know if it mattered. Her phone buzzed again, but she ignored it, staring out at the streets beyond the cafe window. It was dark now. The night had fallen, and the quiet of the world outside mirrored the quiet storm building within her. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his fingers lightly tapping against his coffee mug. The morning light filtered through the window, casting a soft glow across the room, but he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. Everything about his life had felt off for weeks, like something was missing, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. He glanced at Sarah, who was moving around the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if everything was normal. But to him it wasn't. Her distance, the way she would look at her phone more than at him, the late nights, the hollow conversations, they all pointed to something he couldn't ignore any longer. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking through his thoughts. Michael nodded, but it wasn't convincing. He had been asking himself that very question. Was everything truly okay? Why did he feel so disconnected from her? She wasn't the woman he married, not anymore. The warmth between them had long faded, replaced by silence, excuses, and empty routines. He knew something had changed, but he hadn't been able to confront it. Until now. As Sarah moved to grab something from the counter, her phone buzzed. Michael froze, his gaze falling on the screen. For a split second, he saw Alex's name flash across it. His heart stopped. It wasn't the first time he'd seen Alex's name on her phone, but this time, something inside him broke. The instinctive doubt he'd been suppressing for so long suddenly exploded into clarity. Sarah noticed the shift in his posture and quickly grabbed the phone, her fingers shaking as she swiped it off the counter. Michael's pulse quickened. The silent tension in the room thickened, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel like he was in the dark. He was no longer going to let the unspoken fears rule him. "I was just checking my messages," Sarah said, her voice too quick, too defensive. Michael watched her, his mind racing. The rational part of him urged caution to not jump to conclusions, but everything within him screamed that something wasn't right. Something had changed between them, and it wasn't just the surface issues he'd been blaming for their distance. "I don't think you're just checking messages," he said, his voice cold, but his chest tight with unease. "I've noticed it for a while now, Sarah. Something's not right." Her eyes widened, a flash of guilt flickering in her expression before she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Michael, you're overreacting." But Michael was done pretending. His fingers clenched into fists as he leaned forward. "No, I'm not. I see how you've been acting, and I can't ignore it anymore." Sarah's eyes darted around, unable to hold his gaze. She was hiding something. He could feel it in his bones. He had always trusted her, but now doubt poisoned every interaction, every word between them. "You're being paranoid," Sarah said, turning away from him, as if retreating to the comfort of normalcy would make the conversation disappear. But Michael wasn't ready to let it go. He stood up abruptly, closing the distance between them. "I saw Alex's name on your phone," he said, his voice a mix of hurt and accusation. "I saw how you looked at it, how you rushed to hide it from me." Her breath hitched, and for the first time she didn't have an answer. He could see it, the guilt in her eyes, the tightness in her shoulders, the way she couldn't meet his gaze. "I wasn't hiding anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It's not what you think. Michael stared at her for a long moment, the words hanging in the air between them. He wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but something in his gut told him that the truth was more than he could handle right now. You're lying to me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The pain of the realization hit him like a physical blow. You're lying to my face, and I don't know why. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and she quickly wiped them away. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, the crack in her voice breaking his heart. But I've been so lost, Michael. I don't know how we got here. He took a step back, feeling the weight of her words crashing down on him. She was right. They were lost. But how had they gotten here? How had everything they'd built together fallen apart without him even noticing? I don't know who you are anymore, Michael admitted, the weight of the realization sinking in. His hands were shaking now, the anger and heartbreak flooding his body. I don't recognize you. Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling. I've been so unhappy. I've tried to make it work, but it feels like we're just going through the motions. You don't see me, Michael. Not the way you used to. And I found someone who did. The words were like a slap in the face. The raw honesty in her voice was painful, but it was also a slap of reality that Michael couldn't ignore. She had found someone else. It wasn't just the long hours or the cold silence. It was something more, something deeper. I'm sorry, Sarah said, her voice breaking as she reached out to him. I never meant to hurt you. But Michael stepped back, shaking his head. It's too late for apologies, Sarah, he said, his voice raw with pain. You've already hurt me. She collapsed onto the couch, her shoulders trembling with sobs. Michael stood frozen, watching her, the weight of the betrayal crushing him. He didn't know what to do anymore. There was no easy fix, no simple way to put the pieces back together. He turned to leave the room, but before he reached the door, Sarah's voice stopped him. I still love you, Michael, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Michael's heart twisted, but he didn't turn around. Love doesn't make it right, he replied, his voice shaking. And it doesn't erase the lies. He walked out, leaving the woman he once knew behind, and for the first time in years, Michael truly felt alone. Michael stood at the door, his hand resting on the handle, as the reality of what Sarah had just confessed sunk in. Her words echoed in his head like a painful broken melody. I found someone who did. It felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. He wasn't sure if he could stand anymore, but somehow he found the strength to turn back. He stepped back into the living room, his mind clouded with confusion, anger, and a deep guttural sadness. Sarah was still on the couch, her hands pressed against her face, her sobs muffled by her palms. The silence between them felt like a suffocating blanket. I don't understand, Michael said, his voice low, trembling with the weight of his disbelief. I don't understand how we got here, Sarah. How could you do this? She lowered her hands, her tear-streaked face looking up at him. There was guilt in her eyes, but also something else. Fear. The fear of being caught, of being exposed, of facing the consequences of what she had done. I never wanted this, Sarah whispered. I never wanted to hurt you. But I've been so lonely, Michael. You stopped seeing me a long time ago. I felt like I was fading away. Michael shook his head, his breath hitching. Lonely? He repeated. You think I didn't feel lonely too? You think I didn't notice that you were slipping away from me? I didn't mean to push you away, Sarah said quickly, wiping at her eyes. But you were always working, always distant. We weren't us anymore. We were two strangers in the same house. Michael's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say. The pain of her betrayal was overwhelming, but so was the realization that maybe, just maybe, he had failed her too. His work had consumed him, yes, but had he really seen her slipping away? Had he truly looked at her, really looked, in the way she needed him to? You think that's an excuse for what you did? Michael's voice cracked as he spoke, his words dripping with both anger and hurt. You think that makes it okay to lie to me, to betray me like this? I trusted you, Sarah. She shook her head, her hands gripping the sides of the couch as she tried to steady herself. "No, I know it's not okay. I know I've hurt you. But when Alex came into my life, he made me feel like I mattered. He made me feel wanted. And I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know how to go back to the way things were." Michael's heart twisted at the words, but there was also something else. Something that had been buried deep within him for months. Something he couldn't ignore. A small voice in his mind whispered, "This isn't just about the affair. This is about everything that's been broken in this relationship." "I've tried, Michael," Sarah said, her voice raw with emotion. "I tried to make it work, but you were always too far away. You didn't see me, not the way I needed you to." The words cut deeper than he could have imagined. He had been so wrapped up in his work, in his own world, that he hadn't even noticed the slow, silent disintegration of their marriage. The truth stung, bitter and sharp, because he knew she was right. He hadn't been there for her. He had let her fall through the cracks without even realizing it. But still, none of that excused her actions. None of that made it okay for her to turn to someone else. "And now?" Michael asked, his voice trembling. "Now you've made your choice, haven't you? You've made your choice, and I'm not part of it anymore." Sarah's face crumpled as she reached out for him. "Michael, please, no." His voice was firm now, cutting through her pleading. Don't touch me. Don't try to make this better, because it's not. You've already made your choice, Sarah, and I'm not part of it anymore." She recoiled, her hand falling to her lap, the air between them thick with the weight of what she had done. Michael stood there, feeling the raw, jagged edge of her betrayal. He had loved her. He had given her everything he thought she needed. But now, it was all in ruins. "Who is he?" Michael asked, his voice cold and hard, a sharp edge cutting through the haze of his emotions. Sarah hesitated, her eyes flickering nervously, but there was no escaping the truth now. She had already confessed, and it wasn't going to change. "It's Alex," she whispered, the name hanging in the air like a weight. Michael's stomach churned. Alex. The man who had come into their lives quietly at first, but now was the center of everything. The one who had taken his place. The one who had made Sarah feel seen when he, Michael, had been too absorbed in his own world to even notice the distance growing between them. The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. Michael felt his heart cracking, piece by piece. He had never imagined it would come to this. He had never imagined that the woman he loved would be capable of such betrayal. "I didn't want to hurt you," Sarah said again, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix what's broken between us." Michael's eyes burned with unshed tears, but he held them back. He wouldn't cry, not now, not for this. "You can't fix this," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Not anymore." He turned and walked out of the room, the sound of Sarah's sobs echoing behind him. He didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do next, but one thing was clear. His life, his world, had just been shattered, and no apology could ever change that. Michael stood in the hallway, his back pressed against the cold wall, the weight of Sarah's betrayal still fresh in his mind. The words they had exchanged played over and over in his head, each one a dagger to his heart. Alex. Her voice, trembling with guilt, had made it sound like she was asking for forgiveness, but Michael could only hear the silence that had settled between them for months, years even. The silence that had allowed her to slip away. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, lost in his thoughts. His hand tightened around the doorframe, his knuckles turning white. Every inch of him ached. He had to leave the house. He couldn't be here. Not now. He grabbed his jacket and slammed the door behind him, stepping into the cool evening air. He didn't have a plan, but he couldn't stay there. The lies had woven themselves around him so tightly that he couldn't breathe. As he walked down the quiet street, his thoughts began to race. How had he missed it all? The late nights, the secretive glances, the hesitation in her voice whenever he asked her a simple question. How could I have been so blind? His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from Elena. "Michael, I think we need to talk." A wave of frustration surged through him. What could Elena possibly have to say right now? He didn't want to talk to anyone. He didn't want to hear any more lies, any more justifications, not from Sarah, not from anyone. But despite himself, he pressed the screen and called her back. She answered after the first ring. "Michael," Elena's voice was soft but insistent. "I know this isn't easy, but I need to tell you something." He leaned against a lamppost, his anger rising. "I don't need more lies, Elena. I've had enough. Sarah, she's been seeing someone else. He stopped himself, feeling the weight of his own words suffocating him. "I don't know what to believe anymore." There was a long pause before Elena spoke again. "I know, Michael, and that's exactly why I'm calling you. I think you need to know the truth. There's more to this than you realize." His heart skipped. "More? What could possibly be more?" "I'm listening," he said, his voice tight. Elena hesitated before continuing. "You need to understand something about Sarah and Alex. It's not just about the affair, it's deeper than that. Sarah didn't just stumble into this. There's been something between them for longer than you think. She's been lying to you for months. And not just about Alex." The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. His mind reeled, trying to process the weight of what Elena was saying. Lying for months? He wanted to deny it, but the truth was undeniable. Sarah's betrayal wasn't just a mistake. It was a series of lies that had been building up over time. "Elena, please," Michael said, his voice hoarse. "Just tell me what you know." She sighed, her voice lowering. "Sarah's been hiding something, Michael. It's not just about Alex. There's someone else who's been in her life for a while now." The revelation left him breathless. Another person. His head spun, and he gripped the phone tighter as if it could hold him steady. "You're telling me there's more than Alex?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Yes," Elena replied. "Sarah's been seeing someone else, someone you know. I'm not sure of all the details, but I know enough to tell you that the betrayal runs much deeper than just Alex." Michael felt the blood drain from his face. His mind was racing as he tried to make sense of Elena's words. "Someone I know? Who could it be?" "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. "You're telling me there's someone else and you're not even going to tell me who? Elena, why are you doing this now?" Michael's voice cracked with a mix of frustration and confusion. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Elena said, her voice unwavering. "And I don't want you to be blindsided when it all comes out. You need to confront Sarah about everything, Michael. Everything she's been hiding." He felt numb, the weight of the world crushing his chest. This was worse than he had imagined. Sarah's lies were more than just an affair. They were a web of deceit, a series of choices that had led them to this moment, and he had been living in that web, unaware. "Thanks for telling me, Elena," Michael said quietly, hanging up the phone before she could say another word. He stood there in the dark, the air thick with the weight of her words. He couldn't go back now. He couldn't undo what had been done, but he could confront Sarah. He could find out exactly how deep her lies ran. But where do I even begin? The question echoed in his mind as he walked aimlessly through the night. His chest was tight, his thoughts swirling with 1,000 different emotions. When he finally returned home, the house felt colder than ever. It was the same house, the same place he'd shared with Sarah, but it no longer felt like his own. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. He found Sarah sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. She looked up at him, a mixture of fear and guilt in her expression. "I'm sorry, Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to fix it." Michael stood in the doorway, his heart pounding as he looked at her. He had no words, only the burning need for answers. He couldn't look at her the same way anymore. He couldn't pretend everything was fine. "I know what you've been doing, Sarah," he said, his voice cold and steady. "I know about Alex, and there's more. There's more than just him, isn't there?" She froze, the color draining from her face. He could see the panic in her eyes, the fear of being exposed. "Michael, please," Sarah begged, standing up as if to reach out to him. "I never meant for it to go this far, but No," he interrupted, his voice hard. Don't try to justify this. I want the truth, all of it." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Sarah hesitated. The truth was finally coming to light. But whether it would set them free or destroy them completely, neither of them knew. The house was still. Too still. The kind of silence that felt like a thick, suffocating fog pressing down on everything. Michael sat in the living room, staring at the empty space in front of him. His thoughts churned, twisted, and fought for control, but none of it made sense. Nothing about this made sense. Sarah was in the kitchen, though they hadn't exchanged a word in hours. She had barely said anything since that confrontation last night, and Michael had no idea how to move forward. It was as if they were living in two different worlds now. His, filled with anger and betrayal, hers, filled with guilt and fear. But neither world seemed to touch the other anymore. The silence between them was deafening, each minute stretching into an eternity. Michael hadn't expected any words of comfort from Sarah, not now, but the absence of even the smallest gesture, no apology, no attempt to explain herself, left him feeling colder than ever. His hand tightened around the glass of whiskey in front of him. He hadn't even realized he'd poured it. The burn in his throat felt almost like a distraction from the pain in his chest, but even the alcohol couldn't numb the ache. Michael closed his eyes, letting out a slow, controlled breath. He'd been trying to make sense of this for days, weeks even. Why had Sarah gone down this path? Why had she betrayed him like this, with someone who had been a stranger to him until recently? Why had she chosen him of all people? And then there was the deeper question, the one he had barely allowed himself to face. What had he missed? He hadn't been a perfect husband. He knew that. He had buried himself in work, thinking he was doing the right thing, thinking that providing for their family and keeping the house in order was enough. But he had ignored her. He had ignored Sarah. And now, standing on the edge of this wreckage, he wondered if it was already too late to salvage anything. A soft footstep broke his thoughts, and he turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway. She hadn't entered the room yet, almost as if she was waiting for him to acknowledge her presence, but Michael didn't move. The guilt in her eyes was unmistakable. He could see it, even from across the room, despite the distance that separated them. She was waiting for him to say something, to ask her questions, to demand answers, but he wasn't sure if he could do that anymore. "I don't know what you want me to say." Sarah's voice was small, fragile. She was standing at the edge of the room, her posture stiff, but her gaze never left him. She looked lost, terrified even. "I don't know how to fix this." Michael's jaw clenched as his eyes flickered over her. The woman standing in front of him wasn't the person he had known. She was a stranger, a shadow of the woman he had married. And yet he still saw traces of the woman he loved, the one who had once looked at him with warmth in her eyes, the one who had laughed with him over silly things, the one who had cared enough to hold him close when the world outside felt too harsh. But now she was just another part of the mess that had become his life. "I don't know what I want you to say either," Michael finally responded, his voice cold, distant. "You think words can fix this? Can words make the last few months go away? Can they erase the lies?" Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her fingers trembling. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It wasn't supposed to be like this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Michael stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor as he pushed it back. He wasn't sure why he did it, but it felt like something inside him was starting to break. He needed to stand up, to move, to do something to release the tension building in his chest. He was shaking, though, and he didn't want her to see it. He didn't want to show any weakness. "You didn't mean to hurt me," he repeated, his voice rising. "But you did, Sarah. You did. You didn't just hurt me. You shattered everything we built. And for what? A few stolen moments of attention from him?" Sarah flinched at his words, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. There were no words left to justify what she had done. Michael moved to the window and stared out at the view he used to love. The world outside was the same, unchanged, but everything felt different. Everything felt broken. His life, his marriage, his trust, everything was a shattered version of what it once was. "I don't even know who you are anymore," he muttered under his breath. "You've become a stranger to me." There was a long pause. Sarah's voice trembled when she spoke again, barely above a whisper. "I've lost myself too," she said, her words heavy with pain. I don't even know who I am anymore. The admission hung in the air, lingering between them like a bitter taste. Michael could see it now in her eyes, the same emptiness he had been feeling for weeks. Sarah wasn't the woman he had married. She wasn't even the woman he knew anymore. But neither was he. And that was the most painful realization of all. I can't do this, Sarah, he said finally, turning to face her. I can't live in this silence anymore. It's like we're at war with each other, and I don't even know what we're fighting for. Her eyes filled with tears again, and she took a step toward him, her voice breaking. Michael, please, I love you. I'm sorry. Michael closed his eyes, his throat tight. Love? What does that even mean now? After everything? How can I trust you? How can we go back from this? For the first time, Sarah didn't answer. She didn't know how, and neither did he. The silence between them was the loudest thing in the room now, louder than the shouting, louder than the hurt. It was a silent war, one they were both losing, no matter how much they tried to hide it. Michael couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that there was more that Sarah had kept from him, hidden deep under the surface. The confessions of her affair with Alex were brutal, but now, every moment he spent with her, every word she said, felt like it was wrapped in a thick layer of deceit. He couldn't shake the suspicion that Sarah had only scratched the surface, that there were truths yet to be uncovered, and those truths would either destroy him further or, in some twisted way, offer him the clarity he desperately needed. He had spent the entire night awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he had missed it. The signs had always been there, hadn't they? But he had been too blind to see them, too wrapped up in his own world to notice the subtle shifts, the cracks forming in their marriage, in Sarah's demeanor. He had buried himself in his work, thinking it was enough. He thought if he could just provide, if he could just make everything perfect for them, the rest would fall into place. But now, everything had crumbled. Sarah had admitted her affair, but Michael wasn't sure if that was all. Something in her tone last night had made him question whether she had told him everything. The hesitation in her voice, the way she skirted around certain details, made him wonder, was Alex the only one? He had to know the truth. Without warning, Michael stood up from the couch and walked toward Sarah's study, where she kept most of her personal things, her journals, her correspondence, her thoughts that she had kept from him over the years. He knew it wasn't the right thing to do. He knew he should talk to her, confront her, ask her directly, but something in him, some primal need for answers, urged him to search for himself. He felt like a man drowning, and if he could just find the answers, maybe he could pull himself out. The room was quiet as he stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the small desk in the corner where Sarah often worked late into the night. Papers were scattered across it, some unopened, others half-finished. He moved toward the desk, his fingers brushing lightly over the surface. He wasn't sure what he was hoping to find, but he knew he needed something, anything that could explain what had happened, why their relationship had fallen apart so quickly. His gaze fell on an envelope tucked underneath a pile of loose papers. It was addressed to Sarah, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. His heart skipped a beat. The name on the envelope wasn't Alex's. His breath caught in his throat as he pulled it out, the edges of the paper frayed from being shoved hastily away. With trembling hands, he opened it. Inside, there was a letter, but it wasn't a love letter, not like he expected. It wasn't filled with promises or declarations of affection. It was a confession of sorts. The words on the paper were cold, calculated, and at the same time filled with desperation. Sarah had written about another man, someone from her past, someone she hadn't told Michael about. Michael read the letter again, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The words blurred together, but one part stood out above all others. I never told you about him, Michael. I should have, but I was afraid of losing you. He's the one who showed me what I had been missing, but I couldn't walk away. Not yet. Not when I didn't know what you would do. Michael's hand shook as he placed the letter back down. The world seemed to tilt beneath him. He had known Sarah was hiding something, but this? Another man. He had been so caught up in Alex, so focused on the affair that he had missed the bigger picture. There was more to this betrayal than just one mistake. It was a web, a tangled mess of lies, of choices made and secrets kept. And now Michael had to figure out what he was going to do with this truth. The room felt too small, too suffocating. He couldn't breathe. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of the overwhelming flood of emotions coursing through him. Anger, betrayal, confusion. It was all there, swirling inside of him. And yet, beneath it all, there was something else. Fear. He didn't want to confront Sarah again, not yet. But how could he stay silent now? How could he look at her, knowing that this was only part of the story? He needed answers, and he needed them now. Without thinking, he left the study, heading toward the kitchen where Sarah had been sitting earlier. She was there, sitting at the table, staring blankly at her phone. She didn't notice him enter, and for a moment, he just watched her. The woman he had married, the woman who had been his everything, now seemed like a stranger. It was as though the walls between them had grown so high that they couldn't even hear each other anymore. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice low but steady. She looked up at him, startled, as if she hadn't realized he was there. He could see the weariness in her eyes, the exhaustion that had come from months of guilt and lies. "I know about him," Michael said quietly, the words coming out before he could stop them. Sarah's face paled, and for a moment she didn't say anything. Her eyes darted around the room as though looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to run now. The truth was out. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling, but she couldn't finish. "Who is he, Sarah?" he asked again, his voice colder now, the anger creeping in. "Who is this man you've been hiding from me, and how long has this been going on?" Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was trapped, cornered by the very lies she had told. Michael could see it in her face. The guilt, the fear, the realization that everything was unraveling. She had nowhere to hide anymore. "I thought you were done with him," Michael said, his voice shaking now. "I thought it was just Alex, but this is worse. You've been lying to me for so much longer than I ever knew." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out, her hand trembling as she tried to touch his arm. "Michael, please. I never meant for it to go this far. I thought I could fix it. I thought I could fix everything." Michael pulled away from her, the anger now overtaking the sadness. "How many lies do you think I can take, Sarah? How many more secrets do you have?" The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah had no answer, and Michael didn't expect one. The truth had been exposed, but it only left more questions, more layers of betrayal to peel back. And Michael wasn't sure if he could keep doing this. Michael couldn't remember the last time he had felt truly calm. Every breath felt heavy, every thought weighed down by the crushing truth of Sarah's betrayal. The truth that kept getting worse with every new revelation. He had wanted answers. He had needed to know why. But now that he had them, the truth felt like a storm, tearing apart everything he had believed in. The anger, the sadness, the shock, all of it was starting to melt into something much more dangerous. A numbness that felt like it was eating him from the inside out. Sarah had admitted to the affair with Alex, but then there was the man she'd hidden, the one she hadn't told him about, the one she had been seeing before Alex, and now there was no denying it. The lies had been woven so tightly into the fabric of their lives that it felt like he couldn't even see the pieces of his life clearly anymore. He stood there, frozen in place, staring at her. She was sitting at the kitchen table, her face red from crying, her hands nervously wringing the edge of the napkin in front of her. "I can't believe you didn't tell me everything," Michael said quietly, his voice devoid of the sharpness it had carried moments before. It was the calm before the storm, the calm that felt even more dangerous. He was no longer angry. He was beyond angry. "I couldn't," Sarah whispered. She couldn't even meet his eyes. "I thought if I kept it hidden, I could fix things. Fix us. I thought I could make it stop, but it just kept going." The words barely made it past her lips, her voice cracking under the weight of what she had done. Michael wasn't sure what he wanted from her anymore. He wasn't sure what he expected her to say. He wasn't sure what he even wanted. All he knew was that he couldn't stand hearing her voice, hearing the feeble explanations, the regret in her tone. "Fix us?" Michael asked, the words bitter on his tongue. You thought keeping secrets, lying to me, betraying me was going to fix things. I never meant to hurt you, Sarah sobbed, her hands now covering her face, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I was scared, Michael. I was so scared of losing you. Michael exhaled sharply, a harsh, bitter laugh escaping him. And you thought the best way to keep me was to destroy me, to destroy everything we had? She said nothing, the tears now flowing freely. She looked like a broken shell of the woman he once loved, and yet it made no difference. The woman he had known was gone. This woman sitting in front of him wasn't her. She had become someone else entirely. I don't even know who you are anymore, Sarah, Michael said, his voice a quiet whisper. You lied to me for so long. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. It was the silence after his words that felt the loudest. Sarah wiped her tears away, trying to regain some semblance of composure. But the damage was done. The web of lies she had so carefully built around herself had crumbled. There was no more hiding. I don't know if I can trust myself anymore, Sarah murmured, her voice thick with regret. I don't know who I am. I don't know what happened to me. I thought I could just fix things by pretending. But I can't fix it. I can't fix us. Michael shook his head slowly, the finality of her words settling in his chest. You never even tried to fix it, Sarah. You never tried to reach out to me. You chose to run away. You chose to hide. She flinched as if his words had physically struck her. He could see the remorse in her eyes, but it didn't change anything. The damage was done. You've broken everything, Sarah, Michael said, his voice steady but cold. You've broken me, and I don't think there's anything left to fix anymore. Her face crumpled in anguish, her hands now clutching the sides of the chair as if she could somehow hold herself together. She tried to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. The truth was too overwhelming now. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't want to lose you. I never wanted to hurt you. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael stood there staring at her, the woman he had once thought he would grow old with, now nothing more than a stranger. The weight of the betrayal crushed him more than the betrayal itself ever could. Why didn't you tell me, Sarah? Michael asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why didn't you just tell me? We could have worked through it. We could have fought together, but now you've turned everything into a lie. Her tears fell in silence, and Michael couldn't bring himself to comfort her. He couldn't do it. He was too far gone, too shattered by the weight of her actions. I couldn't, Sarah repeated, shaking her head. I thought I could fix it myself. I thought if I kept hiding it would all go away. You can't fix something by hiding it, Michael said, his voice cracking. He turned away from her, feeling the weight of the finality settle in. I can't fix this. I don't even know if I want to. For a moment, he just stood there, his back to her, feeling the silence between them stretch on. It was over. There was no going back. There was no forgiveness left. The truth had been revealed, and it was unforgivable. Michael walked away, leaving Sarah sitting in the room they had once shared, a room now filled with nothing but the wreckage of their love. The house was silent, almost suffocating in its stillness. Michael had been walking through the days in a fog, the weight of the last few weeks pressing on him like a relentless storm. Every step felt heavy, every breath a struggle. The confrontation with Sarah, the revelations, the lies, the betrayal, had left him broken, and yet, here he was, trying to move forward. He didn't know if he could forgive her. He didn't know if he could ever trust her again. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for them, a glimmer of hope. But hope was a fragile thing. It was a fleeting spark that could easily be extinguished by the crushing weight of reality. Still, Michael found himself clinging to it, though he didn't know if it was because he truly believed in the possibility of redemption or because he was afraid of being alone. That evening, Sarah came to him. She had been quiet for days, her silence almost as suffocating as the secrets they had kept from each other. Michael didn't know what to expect when she entered the living room, her steps tentative as she approached him. Michael, she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. Can we talk? He turned to face her, his heart heavy. "What's left to talk about, Sarah?" The words were out before he could stop them, but they were honest. He didn't know if he could do this. He didn't know if he could open himself up again, to risk the pain all over again. "I know I've broken everything," she whispered, her eyes filled with guilt. "But I want to fix it. I need to fix it." Michael looked at her, really looked at her. She was sitting there, her hands clasped tightly together in her lap, the weight of her own guilt and regret written all over her face. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't offering excuses. She was simply asking for a chance. "Sarah, I don't know if I can do this," Michael said, his voice cracking. The walls he had built around his heart felt like they were crumbling, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to let them fall. He wasn't sure if he could trust her again. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can look at you and not feel this rage, this betrayal." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't try to wipe them away. She let them fall, as if the tears were the only thing left she could offer him. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I'm here, Michael, I'm here, and I want to make this right." The room was thick with emotion, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Michael felt torn. His heart screamed to walk away, to end it all, to protect himself from the pain. But another part of him, the part that had loved her so fiercely for so long, ached at the thought of losing her forever. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. There was no easy answer. There was no clear path forward, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. Maybe they could rebuild what had been destroyed, piece by fragile piece. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Sarah," Michael said, his voice raw. "I don't know if I can forget what you've done, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take a step forward, if you are." Her eyes widened, the hope in them so fragile it almost broke his heart. "I am," she whispered. "I am." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The weight of their past hung between them, but in that silence, there was a shift. A shift that wasn't about forgetting the past, but about acknowledging it. A shift that wasn't about forgiveness, but about the possibility of healing. Michael stood up slowly, his heart beating in his chest like a drum. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever truly forgive Sarah for what she had done. But in that moment, he saw something in her, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was love. Maybe it was the simple, fragile hope that they could rebuild something broken. He extended his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation, her fingers trembling in his. The contact felt like a lifeline, weak, uncertain, but there. "We'll take it one step at a time," Michael said softly. "We'll see where this goes, together." Sarah nodded, her face softening, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael saw a flicker of the woman he had fallen in love with. It was small, just a brief spark, but it was enough to remind him of the possibility of healing. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a clean slate, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that was all they needed. Michael had thought that the worst was behind him. He had believed that by facing the truth, the affair, the betrayal, the lies, they could begin to rebuild. But now, sitting in the stillness of their home, he realized how wrong he had been. The truth was far from over. He had taken Sarah's hand in the hope of a fresh start, but the more he tried to move forward, the more the past seemed to pull him back. He wasn't ready to forgive her completely, not yet. But there was a part of him that wanted to believe. He wanted to believe that they could fix this, that there could be healing. But the lingering doubt, the unease that had settled deep inside him, made him feel like he was walking on a tightrope, unsure of whether he would fall or find solid ground beneath his feet. The silence in the room was oppressive. Neither of them had spoken in the last few minutes, and Michael could sense that Sarah was hesitant, as though she was holding something back. He had no idea what it was, but he could feel it, a tightness in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to cling to every word. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice low but steady, "there's something else, isn't there? You've been hiding something from me." Her face flushed and she immediately looked away. The reaction was enough for Michael to know. He could feel the truth curling in the pit of his stomach, something far deeper than the affair itself. Sarah's silence, her avoidance of eye contact, it was all a confirmation of his worst fears. I don't know what you're talking about," Sarah said softly, her voice shaking. Michael stood up, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He wasn't angry, not yet, but the confusion, the betrayal, the sheer weight of it all had pushed him to his limit. "Don't lie to me, Sarah. Not again. I'm not asking you for some half-truths. I need all of it. Every damn secret you've been hiding." Her breath hitched as she finally met his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rawness of the moment hung heavily between them. "I don't want to hurt you more," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "But there's more. I've been carrying this for so long and I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to face you after everything I've done." Michael's chest tightened. He took a step closer to her, not out of anger, but out of a desperate need for answers. He needed to understand. He couldn't move forward with her unless he knew the full extent of what she had done. "Just tell me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I need to know. All of it. I deserve to know the truth." Sarah's eyes filled with tears and she trembled as she looked at him. It was as if the weight of her own guilt was too much for her to bear. "It wasn't just Alex," she whispered, her voice breaking. "There was someone else, someone from before him, someone who meant more to me than I ever realized. I didn't know how to stop it." Michael felt as though the floor had dropped out beneath him. Another man? He had never imagined this. Alex had been the focus of all his anger, but this was something different, something he wasn't prepared for. "Who?" Michael asked, his voice raw. "Who was it, Sarah?" Sarah looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together in nervousness. She hesitated, and for a moment Michael feared she wouldn't tell him at all. But then she spoke, her voice so quiet that he almost didn't catch it. "It was Ryan," she said softly. The name hit Michael like a punch to the gut. Ryan, his old friend, his former colleague, someone he trusted, someone he had welcomed into his home. "Ryan," Michael repeated, his voice cracking. "Are you telling me that you were involved with Ryan?" Sarah nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "It didn't start as anything. We were friends, but there was a moment, a weakness on my part. I didn't want it to happen, but it did, and I couldn't stop it. I didn't know how to tell you." Michael took a step back, his mind reeling. Ryan, the man who had been to their house, shared meals with them, laughed with them. He was supposed to be a friend, a trusted friend. And yet, here he was, another part of the betrayal, another lie that Sarah had kept hidden. "How long?" Michael asked, the question burning in his throat. "How long, Sarah? How long did this go on?" She lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "A few months," she whispered. "It was before Alex. I thought it was just a fling, just a mistake. But it wasn't, and I couldn't stop it. I didn't know how to stop it. I thought if I kept pretending it didn't matter, it would go away. But it never did." Michael felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He had always trusted Sarah, trusted their relationship, and now, in the span of a few sentences, that trust had been shattered. His friend, his brother, had been a part of the betrayal. "I can't believe this," Michael said, his voice trembling with disbelief. "I can't believe you did this. I don't know who you are anymore, Sarah." Her face crumpled in pain, and she reached out to him. "Please, Michael, I'm sorry. I never wanted any of this. I never meant to hurt you." He took a step back, his hands held up as if to ward her off. He didn't want her touch, didn't want the hollow apologies that had become a pattern. He needed space to breathe, to think, to process. "I don't even know what to say to you anymore," he said, his voice cold and distant. "You've lied to me for so long. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I don't know if I can ever believe anything you say." Sarah's face crumpled in anguish as she nodded, tears flowing freely. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything." Michael turned away, walking toward the door. "I need time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to figure this out." Sarah didn't stop him as he left the room. She couldn't. He was already slipping away, and she knew she had pushed him to the edge. There was no going back from this. There was no undoing the damage she had done. But Michael wasn't sure there was anything left to fix anymore. It had been 3 days since Michael had walked out of their house. 3 days of silence that had stretched on like an endless void. Every minute without Sarah felt like an eternity, but every thought of her filled him with confusion, anger, and a deep, gnawing ache. He couldn't escape the memories of their good times, their laughter, the way they used to talk about everything and nothing. And yet, everything was now tainted by the betrayal, the lies, the secrecy. He had told her that he needed time, but as the days passed, he realized he was running out of time. Time to make a decision, time to figure out what came next. Every minute he spent away from her only made it harder to see a way back. The more he thought about the affair with Alex, about the years of hidden truths, the more the weight of it all threatened to break him. But even through the turmoil, a small voice inside him kept whispering, "Is there still hope?" It was that voice that had brought him back to the house tonight. Sarah hadn't tried to reach him, not once, though Michael knew that was probably for the best. She knew she had nothing left to offer but her apologies, and he wasn't ready to hear them. He wasn't ready to listen to the words he had heard too many times. Tonight, however, felt different. The silence in the house felt less like a curse and more like a call to action. He didn't know if he was ready to face Sarah. He didn't know if they could fix what had been broken. But he couldn't stay away forever. He couldn't live with the uncertainty that plagued him. The front door creaked slightly as Michael stepped inside, the darkness of the house wrapping around him like a thick blanket. The smell of their home still lingered, a mixture of old wood, a faint trace of Sarah's perfume, and something that smelled like memory. It was painful, beautiful, a contradiction. Sarah wasn't in the living room, but he could hear her soft sobs coming from the kitchen. His chest tightened at the sound. He had never wanted to be the source of her pain. He had never wanted to hurt her like this. But now, as her sobs echoed in the stillness, he realized how much she had hurt him too. He walked slowly, cautiously toward the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps nearly drowned out by her quiet cries. He paused in the doorway, unsure of what he was even hoping for. He didn't know what kind of resolution he wanted, what kind of conversation he expected to have. "Sarah," he said, his voice low but steady. She froze, the sound of her tears catching in her throat. For a moment there was nothing but silence between them. Neither of them knew what to say. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. She wasn't the same woman he had seen just days ago, the woman he had confronted, the woman who had been lost in her own guilt. This woman was broken, vulnerable. "I didn't know what to do," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make it right." Michael stood there, his heart pounding in his chest. There were so many things he wanted to say, so many questions he wanted to ask, but in this moment, none of them seemed important. The anger, the betrayal, it was all still there, of course, but there was something else too, something he hadn't expected, the glimmer of hope, the same hope that had brought him back tonight. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer now, though his heart was still heavy. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can forget what you've done, but I'm willing to try." Her eyes widened and she stood up quickly, her hands shaking as she reached out to him. "Michael, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I've betrayed you in every way possible. I can't take back what I did, but I will spend every day for the rest of my life trying to make up for it. If you can just find it in your heart to let me try." His eyes met hers, searching for any sign of the woman he had once loved, the woman he still loved, if he was being honest with himself. There was something raw and vulnerable in her eyes now, something that spoke of regret and longing, but also something deeper, a genuine desire to make things right. Michael felt his resolve waver. It wasn't just her words. It wasn't just the apologies, or the guilt, or the regret. It was the sincerity in her eyes, the vulnerability that she had been hiding for so long. She wasn't the same person who had lied to him, who had betrayed him. She had been broken by her own actions. And now, she was laying everything bare, hoping he would see it, hoping he would see her again. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," Michael said, his voice cracking as he spoke. The truth was that he didn't know if he could ever fully forgive her. He didn't know if he could forget the way she had made him feel, the way the world had come crashing down around him. But in that moment, he knew he wasn't ready to give up on her. Not yet. "Just give me a chance," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Please, Michael, let me show you that I'm not the person I was. Let me prove that I can be the woman you deserve." For a long time, Michael didn't respond. He stood there staring at her, his mind racing. There were no guarantees. There was no way to know if they could rebuild what had been destroyed. But the glimmer of hope he had been feeling, a tiny, fragile thing, was enough to make him want to try, to want to believe that it wasn't too late for them. "I'm willing to try," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah stepped toward him, her hands reaching for his, and when they finally touched, for the first time in a long time, Michael felt something in his heart shift. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't trust, but it was a beginning that they could work with if they both tried. Michael stood in the middle of the living room, staring out of the window, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The cool air from the open window was a faint relief against the turmoil inside him. He hadn't moved in hours. His mind was a battlefield, each thought a new conflict, a new challenge. Sarah was upstairs waiting for him. Her eyes, red from crying, had looked up at him with such hope that he would make the decision to give them a chance, to give her a chance. But what if it wasn't enough? What if they had reached a point of no return? He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his breath. But the memories came rushing back. The hurt, the betrayal, the lies. All of it felt like a heavy storm that hadn't passed. He had wanted to believe that they could fix this, that maybe time and effort could heal what had been broken. But what if it was too much? What if their love, what they had once shared, wasn't enough anymore? The sound of Sarah's voice from the top of the stairs broke his reverie. "Michael, please come up here. I need you to hear me." It was the way she said his name that cut through the chaos. It wasn't desperation, no, it was quiet pleading. And for a moment he didn't know if he could face her. Could he hear her? Could he really sit there looking into her eyes and find it within himself to make the hardest decision of his life? For a long time he had believed in their love. They had built a life together, one filled with joy, laughter, shared dreams. But now, with everything out in the open, could he find a way to look beyond the betrayal? Could he really forgive her? The doubt gnawed at him, but as he climbed the stairs he realized something. He wasn't going up there to make a decision for her. He was going up there to make a decision for himself. The door to their bedroom creaked softly as he entered. Sarah was sitting on the edge of their bed, her hands clasped together, her face pale. She wasn't crying anymore. She had already cried all the tears she could, he realized. The woman before him looked smaller than she had in years. And for the first time, Michael truly saw the weight of the mistake she had made. "I don't want to lose you, Michael," Sarah said quietly, looking up at him with those eyes filled with regret, fear, and an ache he knew too well. "I know I've broken everything. I know I've hurt you. But I'm asking for another chance, not to fix it all at once, but to try. Please, I'll do whatever it takes." Michael's heart ached at the sight of her. The woman who had once been the center of his world was now a shadow of herself. He saw it, the brokenness, the remorse, the understanding of how deeply she had hurt him. He didn't want to feel sympathy for her, but he couldn't ignore the truth in her voice, the sincerity in the way she had spoken. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a slow breath, his mind still clouded with all that had happened. What was he supposed to do? What was the right thing? Could he move past this? Could he allow himself to be vulnerable again? When he opened his eyes, Sarah was still waiting, her expression a mixture of hope and terror. Her lips parted as though she was about to speak again, but Michael raised his hand to stop her. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah," he said, his voice low, though it shook with emotion. "I don't know if I'll ever forget the way you made me feel, the way you broke my trust. I can't erase that. I can't erase what you've done." Her face tightened and Michael could see the pain in her eyes, the recognition that she might lose him forever. But there was something else in her gaze, something that made him pause. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm asking for a chance to show you that I can be the woman you deserve, to show you that I can love you the way you need to be loved. I'm asking for time, Michael, time to prove that I can earn back your trust." Michael stared at her, his chest tight. Her words cut deep. She wasn't asking for anything easy. She wasn't asking him to forgive her overnight. She was asking for a chance, a glimmer of hope that they could somehow rebuild what had been shattered. And there, in that quiet moment, Michael knew something. He knew that there was no clear answer. There was no magic fix. They couldn't just go back to how things were. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a new path, one that would lead them toward healing, one step at a time. He moved toward her, his steps slow but purposeful. The distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. But as he sat beside her on the bed, he felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close. A willingness to try, to see if there was anything left. "I'm not promising anything," Michael said, his voice soft but steady. "But I'm willing to try, Sarah, for both of us." She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You mean it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Michael nodded. "I don't know what the future holds, Sarah, but I'm willing to find out with you. If you're really ready to put in the work, to prove to me that this isn't just words, then I'll try." Tears filled Sarah's eyes once more, but this time they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of relief. She reached for him, and without hesitation, Michael wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. The weight of the world didn't disappear, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they could face it together. The decision had been made. Not the easy one, not the one that erased the past, but the one that allowed them both a chance at something new. They would take it one step at a time, together. The days after Michael's decision were a blur of small, fragile moments. They were no longer the perfect couple they had once been, but neither were they the strangers who had been caught in a web of lies. Instead, they were something else, something uncertain, something raw. It was as though they had been given a second chance, but that chance was fragile, and Michael knew it wasn't going to be easy. There were no magic fixes, no quick remedies to erase the damage. The pieces were broken, scattered across the floor, and it was up to them both to rebuild it, slowly, carefully, one shard at a time. Michael had agreed to try. That was the first step, but he didn't know what that really meant. He didn't know if he could truly forgive Sarah, or if he would ever fully trust her again. It wasn't something that could be fixed in a week or even a month. It was going to take time, and neither of them could rush it. Not anymore. The first few days after their conversation were quiet. They didn't talk much. Sarah was careful with her words, and Michael was careful with his emotions. He didn't know what he was supposed to say. He didn't know how to start. How could they just pick up where they left off, when everything had been shattered? They spent most of their time in the same house, but the distance between them felt vast. There were no romantic gestures, no attempts to pretend everything was fine. It was an awkward, strained silence, one that neither of them was sure how to navigate. It was Sarah who first broke the silence. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant as they sat together on the couch, the space between them a few feet too far. "Maybe we should go to therapy." Michael glanced over at her. It wasn't the first time she had suggested it, but this time there was something different in her voice, something genuine. "I think that's a good idea," he said, his voice low but steady. "We need someone to help us figure this out." Sarah nodded, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I know I can't make everything better overnight. I just want to start. I want to show you that I can be the woman you need me to be. I know I have to earn your trust again. I know it's not going to be easy, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Michael didn't know if he was ready to believe that yet. He didn't know if he could look at Sarah and not feel the sting of the past, The images of betrayal still haunted him, and the pain of what had happened lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. But he also knew that they couldn't stay here in this limbo forever. "I'm willing to try," Michael said, his voice soft but resolute. "But I need to be honest with you, Sarah. I'm not sure how long it will take. I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to look at you the same way again. But I'm willing to try." She reached out for his hand then, her fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against his. Michael didn't pull away. He didn't know what it meant to hold her hand in this moment, but he let her. He let her touch him because, somewhere deep down, he still wanted to believe in them. The next few weeks were a slow, painful process. Therapy helped, but it didn't fix everything. The sessions were filled with raw emotions, difficult conversations, and the kind of truth that made both of them uncomfortable. But it was necessary. They had to face what had happened. They had to confront the lies, and they had to be willing to rebuild from the rubble. For Sarah, it was about admitting the depth of her mistakes, admitting that the affair wasn't just a moment of weakness, but a choice she had made. And for Michael, it was about acknowledging his own part in the breakdown of their relationship. He had been distant, focused on work, too wrapped up in his own world to see that Sarah needed him. "I wasn't there for you," Michael admitted one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. They were sitting in their living room, both of them exhausted from another session with the therapist. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I wasn't paying attention to you. I wasn't paying attention to us." Sarah turned to look at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "I don't know if that would have made a difference, Michael. I don't know if anything would have stopped me. But I'm sorry. I never should have done what I did. I betrayed you in every way, and I can't take that back. I can only try to show you that I'm different now." Michael nodded slowly. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know if they would ever be able to fully heal, if they would ever fully rebuild what had been shattered. But he was willing to try. He was willing to fight for it, for them, because deep down, he knew that this was his chance. This was his chance to decide whether he wanted to give up on the life they had built or whether he could find a way to move forward. One evening after a quiet dinner, Sarah turned to him, her voice steady but filled with vulnerability. "I know it's not enough yet, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm going to keep fighting for us, for you, for me, for everything we were." Michael looked at her, his heart still heavy with all the unanswered questions, the pain that hadn't yet healed. But in that moment he realized something. He wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not completely. "I'm here too," Michael said softly, his voice a quiet echo of his own uncertainty. "I don't know if I can trust you yet. I don't know what the future holds, but I'm willing to fight with you." It wasn't a promise that things would be easy. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay, but it was a step, a small step forward, and in that moment it was enough. Michael knew this moment was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the way Sarah had been looking at him with a mixture of fear and hope for the past few days. She had tried to show him that she was committed to changing, to proving that she could earn back his trust, but he knew there was more. There had to be. He could feel it, a knot in his gut, an unease that had been growing inside him. The silence between them had been too heavy, too full of unspoken words. It had been weeks since their last therapy session, and despite the small steps they had taken forward, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was something Sarah was still hiding. He had tried to push the suspicion out of his mind. He had tried to believe in her, in the changes she claimed to be making, but the nagging voice in the back of his head wouldn't let it go. He had to confront her. He couldn't live in this uncertainty anymore. Tonight, Sarah had gone out to meet a friend. Michael hadn't asked where she was going. He hadn't needed to. But as soon as the door closed behind her, he found himself pacing the floor, his mind racing. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had hoped never to call. Ryan's number. The man who had been part of the betrayal. The one who had been so casually involved in their lives, his life, without Michael even knowing it. The phone rang 3 times before Ryan picked up. Hello? Ryan's voice was casual, almost too casual for what Michael needed to hear. It's Michael, Michael said, his voice steady but tight with barely contained rage. I need to talk to you, now. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Michael could practically hear Ryan trying to figure out what this was about. What's going on? Ryan asked finally, his voice more cautious now. Michael didn't waste time. I know about you and Sarah, about everything, about what happened. Ryan's silence was all the confirmation Michael needed. He didn't wait for Ryan to speak. You lied to me, Ryan. You were a part of this. You knew and you didn't say a word. I need to know why. Why did you do this? Why didn't you tell me? Ryan sighed heavily, and for a moment Michael thought he was going to hang up. But then Ryan spoke, his voice low, a bit of guilt slipping through his usual bravado. I don't know what to say, man. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for things to get this complicated. A mistake? Michael repeated, his voice cold with disbelief. A mistake? You've been lying to me for months, Ryan. You've been sleeping with my wife. That is not a mistake. That's a choice. So don't try to tell me it was just some accident. I want the truth. Why did you do it? There was a long silence before Ryan spoke again, his voice strained. I don't know. I wasn't thinking, okay? I didn't know what I was doing. Sarah and we started talking and one thing led to another. I didn't want to hurt you, Mike. I didn't. But it happened. And now I regret it. I regret everything. Michael could feel his blood boiling, his heart hammering in his chest. The betrayal from Ryan was just as deep as Sarah's. He had trusted him, trusted both of them, and they had both broken that trust in ways he couldn't even comprehend. I want you to stay away from her, Ryan, Michael said, his voice steady now but laced with anger. I don't want you anywhere near Sarah. Not now, not ever. If you care at all about me, you'll respect that. Ryan didn't argue. He didn't even say anything for a moment. I understand, he finally said. I'm sorry, Michael. I never wanted to hurt you. Michael slammed the phone down without another word. He stood there for a long moment, his heart racing, as the reality of everything settled on him. The pieces were all coming together, and he realized how much damage had been done. But there was still one more thing he had to do. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door, his mind made up. He was going to confront Sarah. She had lied to him. She had betrayed him, and now there was nothing left to hide. The front door creaked when he opened it, and he stepped out into the quiet of the night. He wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming, but he couldn't stay in the dark anymore. He found her at the cafe, sitting at a table by the window, sipping a drink and chatting with a friend. Michael walked toward her, his eyes fixed on her, his heart pounding in his chest. When Sarah saw him, her smile faded. Her eyes widened as she realized what was happening. Michael, she started, her voice shaky. I know everything, Sarah, he said, his voice low and steady. I know about Ryan. I know about the lies. I know that you've been hiding things from me, things I shouldn't have had to find out this way. Her face went pale. She looked like she was about to collapse, her hands trembling as she put her drink down. Michael, I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't know how to tell me? Michael repeated, the hurt in his voice more intense than he realized. How much more could you have hidden, Sarah? How much more do I have to know before you finally tell me the truth? She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, Michael saw the woman she used to be, the woman who had once loved him, the woman who had been his everything. But that woman was gone, and all that was left was this stranger, a woman who had broken him, betrayed him, and left him wondering if he could ever trust again. I didn't want to lose you, Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't want to destroy us. You did, Michael said quietly. You did destroy us, Sarah. And now I have to decide if we can fix this. But right now I don't know. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, helpless and broken. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to do. The truth had come out. But it didn't change the way he felt. It didn't make the pain go away. The final confrontation had been made, and now Michael had to make the hardest decision of all. Could he ever truly forgive her? Could he ever trust her again? And was it even worth trying to fix what had been shattered? Michael sat at the small table in the corner of the cafe, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of his coffee cup. The weight of everything he had been through seemed to settle over him like a heavy cloud, yet there was a strange sense of calm that lingered beneath the surface. The anger, the sadness, and the confusion were still there, of course. But now, there was something else, something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. It wasn't a loud, triumphant kind of hope, like some perfect resolution. It was quiet and fragile, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. It was the belief that maybe, just maybe, things could start to heal. Maybe with time and effort they could find a way back to what they once had. Or at least, build something new. He glanced across the room where Sarah sat. She had been quiet since their conversation the night before, her eyes searching his face for some sign, some indication of what he was feeling. But Michael hadn't given her much. He wasn't ready to say everything out loud, but the truth was, he was trying. He was trying to look past the hurt, trying to look past the betrayal, and see her for who she was now. Not the woman who had lied to him, not the woman who had torn their life apart, but the woman who was sitting across from him, her face pale, her heart laid bare. She had confessed everything. She had faced the consequences of her actions, and now she was waiting for him to decide whether they could move forward, or whether their relationship was truly beyond repair. "I know it's not going to be easy," Sarah finally said, her voice breaking the silence between them. "But I want you to know that I'm here. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I can be the woman you need me to be." Michael met her gaze, and for the first time in days, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It wasn't desperation. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, something more genuine. It was the recognition of the damage she had caused, and the quiet, steadfast determination to make things right. The words she spoke were simple, but they carried weight. The weight of her sincerity, the weight of her willingness to fight for them. She wasn't asking for immediate forgiveness. She wasn't demanding that everything go back to the way it was. She was asking for a chance to rebuild, a chance to prove that the woman she was now was not the same as the one who had hurt him so deeply. Michael took a deep breath. His heart was still heavy, but there was a new resolve within him. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he could ever fully trust Sarah again, or if he could forget the pain she had caused him. But in that moment, he realized that the past didn't have to define their future. The decision wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about choosing whether or not they could rebuild from it. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you," Michael said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if I'll ever forget the way you hurt me. But I do know this. I'm willing to try. I'm willing to try and move forward, Sarah. I can't promise it will be easy. I can't promise there won't be more pain along the way, but I'm willing to try." The relief that washed over Sarah's face was immediate. It was as if a weight had been lifted off her shoulders, though Michael knew that the real work was still ahead of them. This wasn't a happily ever after moment. It wasn't a clean slate, but it was a beginning, a real, honest beginning. "I'll prove it to you," Sarah whispered, her voice full of conviction. "I'll prove that I'm worthy of your trust. I'll spend every day showing you that I'm not the same person I was." Michael nodded slowly. It wasn't a decision he had made lightly, and it certainly wasn't the end of the journey. But as he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, he saw something more than the woman who had betrayed him. He saw a woman who was willing to do the hard work, who was committed to making things right, and who was still there, still fighting for them. And for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. "I don't know how long it will take," Michael said, his voice softer now, "but we'll take it one day at a time, together." They both sat there for a moment, the weight of the past still hanging between them, but the quiet hope of the future starting to take shape. Neither of them knew what the road ahead would look like. There would be more struggles, more challenges, more moments of doubt. But for now, that was okay. For now, they had each other. In that moment, Michael realized that it wasn't about pretending the hurt didn't exist. It wasn't about moving past it in an instant. It was about choosing to rebuild, choosing to take the first steps toward healing, even when the path ahead seemed uncertain. As Sarah reached for his hand, Michael didn't pull away. He let her touch him, let her hand find its place in his. It was a small gesture, but it was a gesture of something more. It was a gesture of willingness, of possibility. And for the first time, Michael felt that maybe they could do this. Maybe they could rebuild the pieces, even if they had to do it slowly. Maybe they could find their way back to each other, one step at a time. The days following their conversation had been quieter, though not without their challenges. Michael had started to let his guard down just a little, but the scars of the past were still fresh. He wasn't ready to forget what had happened. How could he? But he had started to understand that moving on didn't mean pretending it hadn't been real. Moving on meant accepting that the pain would always be there, but it didn't have to define their future. It was a difficult pill to swallow, but one that he had to learn to live with. He could no longer hold on to the anger. He could no longer let it rule him. Trust would take time to rebuild, and there were no shortcuts. The path ahead was unknown, but he was beginning to see that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about living with it. Sarah had been patient, more patient than he had ever expected. She had given him the space he needed, but she had also shown up every day, proving through her actions that she was committed to the work. She wasn't perfect, and neither was he, but they were both willing to try, and that for now was enough. Michael found himself thinking about the things he had ignored before, the moments when Sarah had reached out to him when she had needed him, and he hadn't been there. The work he had buried himself in had always been an excuse, a distraction, but now he knew better. He knew that he couldn't fix everything, that he couldn't make up for lost time, but he could move forward. He could be present. He could show up for her in ways he never had before. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick, but they were trying, and that meant something. "Michael, can we talk?" Sarah's voice pulled him from his thoughts, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, looking at him with that familiar, uncertain expression. There was a hesitance in her eyes, but also something more. It was an openness he hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that was raw but real. He nodded, gesturing for her to sit beside him. She did, though there was a moment of silence before either of them spoke. "I've been thinking," Sarah began, her voice quiet but steady. "I know it's been hard for you to trust me again, and I get that, but I need you to know I'm not the same person I was. I've been working on myself. I want you to see that. I want you to see that I'm committed to this, to us." Michael watched her, taking in every word. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the walls inside himself rising. He didn't feel the urge to push her away. "I see that, Sarah," Michael replied, his voice soft, but it carried the weight of everything they had been through. "And I'm trying too. I'm trying to be present. I'm trying to show up. I know I haven't been perfect, but I'm here. I want to work on this with you." A small, tentative smile tugged at the corners of Sarah's lips, and for a moment it felt like the world had shifted just slightly, not enough to erase the past, but enough to make the future feel possible. "I'm sorry," Sarah said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "I'm sorry for what I did to you. I can't take it back, but I can promise I'll never hurt you like that again." Michael took a deep breath, his heart heavy but not as burdened as before. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could learn to move forward with her. Not for the sake of fixing everything, but for the sake of moving on. "I don't expect you to forget," Michael said, his voice firm yet gentle, "but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to take the steps with you. I can't promise it will be easy, and I can't promise it will be fast, but I want to give this a chance. I want to move on. With you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the same tears of regret from before. These were tears of hope, of a future she wasn't sure was possible but wanted to fight for. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you for giving us a chance." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with the weight of everything they had been through. It was different this time. It was filled with the quiet understanding that moving on wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it and deciding together that they wanted to move forward. Michael took Sarah's hand, feeling the warmth of her touch, and for the first time, he realized that moving on didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean erasing the hurt or the scars. It meant learning to live with it, to accept it, and to choose each other, despite everything that had happened. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't know what the future held. But in that moment, they knew something important. They were willing to try. They were willing to move on together. And for Michael, that was enough.